By the time Thomas Carter placed the envelope on the table, Richard Whitmore had already decided what kind of man he was. A nobody, the Whitmore dining room glowed beneath a chandelier that had cost more than most houses. Crystal glasses caught the warm light. Silverware rested perfectly beside porcelain plates, and beyond the tall windows, the city stretched beneath a cold December sky. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying Thomas across the table. "You know," he said casually, "some people marry into wealth. Others simply hope their family can survive around it." Emma's fingers tightened around her napkin. Daniel looked at his father. "Dad." Richard barely acknowledged him. Emma knew exactly what Richard meant. He had never accepted her family. To him, Thomas was just a retired businessman who had arrived wearing a modest gray suit in a room designed for billionaires. Thomas, however, continued eating. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. That seemed to irritate Richard more than anger would have. Then Thomas placed his fork beside his plate. The small sound made everyone look up. He reached inside his jacket and removed a plain cream-colored envelope. Emma stared at it. She had never seen it before. Thomas slid it across the polished table until it stopped directly in front of Richard. "Richard," he said quietly, "before you make your next decision, you should probably read this." For the first time that evening, Richard's confidence disappeared. He picked up the envelope. The seal was old. Very old. He opened it. His eyes moved across the first page, then stopped. The color slowly drained from his face. Daniel noticed. Emma noticed. Even Linda, who had spent years pretending not to notice anything uncomfortable at the dinner table, leaned forward. Richard read the first paragraph again. Then a second time, he lowered the paper slightly and looked across the table at Thomas. The man he had just mocked was watching him without a trace of anger. Only certainty. And suddenly, Richard realized there was a reason Thomas Carter had spent 10 years allowing everyone to believe he had nothing. He had been waiting. And tonight, Richard had finally given him a reason to stop. To Richard Whitmore, Thomas Carter's life was proof that money had never been meant for him. Thomas drove a 12-year-old sedan. He bought his clothes from ordinary department stores and lived in a quiet suburban house with faded shutters and a narrow driveway. There were no security guards at his door, no imported sports cars in the garage, and no expensive artwork hanging on his walls. Richard noticed everything. He had once joked that Thomas's entire house could probably fit inside the guest room of the Whitmore estate. Thomas never seemed offended. He had simply chosen a different life. For Emma, that life had been home. She remembered Saturday mornings when her father would make pancakes while listening to the radio. She remembered school mornings when he checked her backpack twice before driving her to class. When she was 16 and came home furious because another student had mocked her for wearing the same shoes 3 days in a row, Thomas hadn't offered to buy her new ones. Instead, he sat beside her at the kitchen table. "Emma," he had said, "money should make your life easier, not make you better than someone else." She hadn't understood the sentence completely then. She understood it now. Thomas had never measured people by cars, houses, watches, or bank accounts. He believed wealth was useful only when it gave someone freedom to live with dignity. That philosophy had shaped Emma more than she realized. But there was one part of her father's life she had never understood. Behind his modest house stood an aging 2-car garage. One side held gardening tools, old boxes, and the same workbench Thomas had used for years. The other side remained locked. Emma had asked about it once when she was a child. "What's in there?" Thomas had smiled and closed the door. "Things from another chapter of my life." She had laughed and forgotten about it. Years later, she still didn't know what was inside. But every few months, Thomas would unlock that door alone. He would enter the dark room, switch on a single fluorescent light, and stand before a steel cabinet covered in dust. Inside that cabinet were documents Richard Whitmore had spent 17 years believing were gone. And Thomas had never once forgotten where he kept the key. Richard waited until the house had gone quiet before calling Daniel into his study. The heavy wooden doors closed behind them, separating father from son and leaving the rest of the Whitmore family outside. Richard remained standing beside his desk. "You're taking over the North American division next year," he said. Daniel frowned. "I thought Marcus was handling that." "Marcus is handling it now. You will be handling it then." For a moment, Daniel was pleased. The position was exactly the kind of responsibility he had spent years working toward. Then Richard continued, "There is one condition." Daniel's expression changed. Richard opened a folder and pushed it across the desk. "I want Emma completely separated from the business." Daniel stared at him. "She doesn't work here. She doesn't need to." Richard's voice remained calm, almost businesslike. "No company events. No access to internal information. No involvement in family decisions concerning the business. And if you expect to lead this company someday, you need to understand that your wife cannot influence those decisions." Daniel slowly closed the folder. "You're asking me to choose." Richard looked at him. "I'm asking you to understand what is at stake." The words followed Daniel out of the study. He found Emma in the upstairs hallway, standing beside the window. She had heard enough. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Daniel admitted what his father had demanded. Emma didn't look surprised. "That's what he wants?" Daniel nodded. She turned toward him. "Your father doesn't want me out of your life." Daniel waited. "He wants me out of your family's power." The sentence landed harder than he expected. Daniel thought about the dinner. The envelope. The way Richard's face had changed when Thomas placed it on the table. Suddenly, those moments didn't feel unrelated. For years, Daniel had assumed his father's objections were about class. Richard believed the Whitmore name needed to be protected, and Emma simply didn't fit the image he wanted. But this was different. This was control. Daniel walked toward the window. "What do you think is in that envelope?" Emma looked down the hallway toward the staircase. "I don't know." Then she paused. "But I think my father does." For the first time, Daniel wondered whether Richard had spent years underestimating the wrong person. And if Thomas Carter had finally decided to speak, Daniel suspected his father's ultimatum might be the least important thing about to change. By Monday morning, Richard Whitmore had pushed the family dinner out of his mind. There were bigger things to worry about. At 9 o'clock, the executive conference room on the 42nd floor filled with lawyers, analysts, and senior directors. At the center of the table sat Marcus Hale, Richard's chief financial officer, with a thick acquisition report open in front of him. "The final valuation is $620 million, Marcus said. "If we close this week, we secure the company's distribution network across 3 major markets." Richard glanced at the projection on the screen. That was exactly what he wanted. The acquisition would strengthen Whitmore Global Holdings, increase its logistics reach, and give Richard another strategic advantage over his competitors. "Then we close this week," he said. Marcus didn't move. "There's one issue." Richard looked up. "The historical ownership records aren't completely verified." A few people around the table shifted uneasily. Richard's expression hardened. "How much is unverified?" "Enough that legal wants another review." Richard leaned back. "We've already spent months reviewing this." "Not these records." Marcus opened another file. "There are older agreements involving the company's original strategic consultant. Some of the documentation dates back nearly 2 decades. Richard barely glanced at the page. "Then have legal handle it." Marcus hesitated. The consultant was Carter Strategic Logistics. Richard's hand stopped moving. For a moment, the room seemed unusually quiet. The name sat there on the page. Carter Strategic Logistics. He hadn't heard it spoken aloud in years. Marcus noticed the change in his expression. "Do you recognize them?" Richard looked back at the screen. "No." The answer came too quickly. Marcus studied him, but said nothing. Richard stood and walked toward the window. Below him, traffic moved through the city in orderly streams. He told himself it was nothing. Carter Strategic Logistics had been out of the picture for years. Thomas Carter had retired. Thomas had chosen an ordinary house, an ordinary car, an ordinary life. He was no threat. At least, that was what Richard had believed. He turned from the window. "Proceed with the acquisition," he said. "I don't want unnecessary delays." Marcus closed the file. But as everyone began leaving the room, Richard remained behind. His eyes returned to the old company name on the screen. For the first time in 17 years, a question he thought he had buried came back. What exactly had happened to Carter Strategic Logistics? And why had Thomas Carter suddenly appeared at his dinner table with an envelope? Emma waited until she was alone with her father before telling him what Richard had demanded. They sat across from each other in Thomas's quiet kitchen. Rain tapped against the window, and an untouched cup of tea cooled between them. Thomas listened without interrupting. He didn't ask whether Richard had insulted him. He didn't ask what Daniel had said. He asked only one question. Did he threaten you? Emma hesitated. Not directly. Thomas nodded slowly. Then he's still giving us time. Emma frowned. What does that mean? Her father stood and walked toward the hallway. Come with me. He took a small key from the back of a drawer and led her toward the garage. Emma hadn't been inside that room in years. Thomas unlocked the door. The smell of old paper and metal filled the space. He walked past the workbench and stopped in front of the steel cabinet she remembered from childhood. For years, she had imagined it contained old photographs or business souvenirs. Thomas inserted the key. The lock clicked. Inside were neatly organized folders, financial records, contracts, correspondence, and several thick binders bearing the faded name of Carter Strategic Logistics. Emma stared at them. Dad. Thomas didn't answer. He pulled out a dark blue folder and placed it on the workbench. On its cover was a date from 17 years earlier. Emma looked at him. You knew this would happen? I knew Richard would eventually make a decision he couldn't undo. Thomas opened another drawer and removed an old mobile phone. He scrolled through the contacts until he found one name. James Porter. Emma recognized it from childhood. James had been around their family occasionally, though she'd never understood why. Thomas pressed call. The conversation lasted less than a minute. When he hung up, he looked toward the rain-covered garage window. I think it's time we stop pretending I'm retired. Emma felt a chill move through her. Who is James Porter? Thomas closed the cabinet. Someone who remembers what really happened. He picked up the blue folder, and for the first time in her life, Emma realized that her father's quiet life had never been the whole story. He had simply kept the other half locked away. The problem surfaced 2 days later. Richard was halfway through a meeting with his legal team when the senior attorney closed his laptop and looked across the table. We found something. Richard didn't like the way he said it. What? The attorney placed a photocopy of an old contract in front of him. There is a contractual clause attached to the original ownership structure of the acquisition target. It was never formally terminated. Richard scanned the page. That can't be right. It is. Marcus Hale leaned forward. What does it mean? The attorney pointed to a paragraph near the bottom. If this clause remains enforceable, certain strategic rights connected to the company's distribution assets may not have transferred as completely as we assumed. Richard's eyes narrowed. Who authorized it? The attorney hesitated. Carter Strategic Logistics. The room went quiet. Richard took the document from him. The name was printed clearly beneath the authorization section. Carter Strategic Logistics. And beneath it was a signature. Thomas Carter. Richard stared at it. No. Marcus watched him carefully. Richard? He had nothing to do with this. The words came out almost defensively. The attorney looked confused. This agreement is 17 years old. The records indicate otherwise. Richard pushed the paper back across the table. Find the original. We're trying. Then try harder. The meeting ended shortly afterward, but Marcus remained behind. He opened an old corporate archive on his tablet. I think you should see this. Richard didn't answer. Marcus turned the screen toward him. A scanned photograph appeared. It was taken 17 years earlier at an industry conference. Richard recognized the ballroom immediately. He remembered the night. He remembered the deal. And standing beside him in the photograph was a younger Thomas Carter. Not wearing the inexpensive clothes Richard had mocked. Not looking like a retired nobody. Thomas was standing beside Richard as an equal. Richard's face slowly lost its color. Marcus looked from the photograph to him. "You said you didn't know him." Richard said nothing. His eyes remained fixed on the image. Because suddenly, the old contract wasn't the only thing he remembered. He remembered Thomas shaking his hand. He remembered promises made in that room. And most disturbingly, he remembered exactly what Thomas had been promised in return. 17 years later, Richard had spent a fortune trying to buy something he was no longer sure he completely owned. Richard spent the next 6 hours trying to convince himself that the photograph meant nothing. It didn't work. By midnight, the legal team had located the original agreement. The document was older than most of the executives currently working for Whitmore Global Holdings. Its pages were yellowed at the edges, but the signatures were unmistakable. Thomas Carter, Richard Whitmore, and beneath them, a partnership agreement that changed everything. 17 years earlier, Thomas had built a logistics system that connected regional suppliers with distribution centers faster and more efficiently than anything Richard's company had at the time. He had also developed a strategic network of independent carriers that gave businesses access to markets they couldn't reach alone. Richard had recognized the value immediately. Whitmore Global Holdings had money. Thomas had the technology, relationships, and operational knowledge. Together, they could build something neither could create alone. The agreement gave Whitmore commercial rights to expand Thomas's system under a carefully defined structure. But Thomas retained specific strategic rights. And there was another condition. Richard had promised that Thomas's employees would be protected as the company expanded. Their jobs, their contracts, their benefits. Thomas would remain involved, but he would eventually step away from the spotlight. Richard had agreed, and Thomas had believed him. That was the part Richard remembered most clearly. After the partnership succeeded, Thomas didn't fight for publicity. He didn't demand a larger title. He didn't insist that his name appear on every announcement. He simply walked away. For years, Richard told everyone the expansion was his achievement. Eventually, even he began believing it. But the records told another story. Within 3 years, dozens of Thomas's original employees had been pushed out. Their contracts were rewritten. Several parts of the original network were absorbed without the protections Thomas had negotiated. And Thomas never sued, never went public, never retaliated. Richard had interpreted that silence as weakness. He had been wrong. When Marcus finally read the agreement aloud, one sentence left Richard staring at the page. Thomas had retained rights over certain strategic assets unless he formally surrendered them. He never had. Richard lowered himself into his chair. So he could have challenged us all this time? Marcus nodded. Richard looked toward the city outside his office. No, he whispered. He chose not to. And suddenly the man Richard had spent years dismissing as irrelevant became something far more dangerous. A man with evidence. A man with patience. And a man who had finally decided that enough was enough. For 17 years, Richard had mistaken Thomas's silence for surrender. He never understood what that silence had cost. After the partnership succeeded, Thomas's wife became seriously ill. The business that had once consumed his days suddenly seemed insignificant beside hospital rooms, sleepless nights, and the quiet fear of losing the person who had shared his life. When she died, Thomas made a decision. He stepped away, not because he had lost, because he had a daughter who still needed him. Emma was young enough to remember the funeral, but too young to understand why her father stopped answering business calls after that. Thomas wanted something simple for her. A normal childhood, a normal home, a father who came home for dinner instead of flying across the country. He could have taken Emma into the world of billion-dollar deals and private boardrooms. He could have told her exactly how much money he had helped create. He chose not to. He deliberately made his life look smaller than it was. Emma grew up believing her father had simply retired after a successful career. And Thomas was comfortable with that misunderstanding. He wanted her to learn who she was without knowing what her father's name could buy. Years passed. Emma became independent, compassionate, and quietly confident. Thomas watched from a distance as she built a life of her own. Then she married Daniel. Thomas had never expected Richard to welcome her with open arms, but he had hoped the man would at least respect her. Instead, Richard looked at Emma and saw a weakness in his family. He looked at Thomas and saw someone insignificant, and now Richard wasn't merely insulting them. He was trying to control Emma's place in Daniel's life and determine whether she belonged anywhere near the family business. That was the moment Thomas finally understood something painful. His silence had protected Emma from the world he had left behind, but continuing that silence would no longer protect her. It would leave her standing alone against it. Thomas returned to the garage that evening and opened the steel cabinet again. He ran his fingers across the old files. Then he reached for the oldest one. For 17 years, he had chosen peace. Now, for his daughter, he was prepared to choose truth. Thomas didn't call Richard. He didn't send a threatening letter or make a public accusation. Instead, he called James Porter. By the following morning, James had begun assembling everything they might need. The original partnership agreement, correspondence from 17 years earlier, financial records, employee contracts, and copies of every amendment Richard's company had made since Thomas stepped away. Nothing was rushed. Every document was checked against another. Thomas wanted facts, not revenge. His goal had never been to destroy Richard. He wanted Emma to stop being treated as though she needed permission to belong in her own marriage. He wanted Daniel to be free to make decisions about his future without his father holding the family business over his head. And most of all, he wanted Richard to understand something he had forgotten long ago. Power and ownership were not the same thing. While James worked, Richard chose a different approach. He called Thomas directly. "You've been quiet for a long time," Richard said. Thomas sat at his kitchen table, listening. "I'd hate to see you damage your daughter's marriage because of an old business dispute." Thomas said nothing. Richard continued. "You know what happens when private agreements become public. People start asking questions. Your reputation, your finances, your family. None of them would come out untouched." Thomas looked toward the window. Outside, Emma's old bicycle still leaned against the garage wall, even though she hadn't ridden it in years. "Are you threatening me?" Thomas asked. "No, I'm giving you advice." Thomas almost smiled. After the call ended, James looked up from the documents. "What did he say?" Thomas placed the phone on the table. "He thinks I'm afraid." James studied him. Thomas opened the oldest folder. "You spent 17 years thinking I had nothing," he said quietly. "That was your advantage. It was also your mistake." James said nothing. There was no need. For the first time, Thomas wasn't preparing to fight Richard with anger. He was preparing to let the truth speak for itself. And somewhere across the city, Richard was about to discover that the man he had underestimated had been preparing for this moment far longer than he realized. The final board meeting began at 8:30 on Thursday morning. Richard arrived first. By then, he had convinced himself that the problem with Thomas could still be contained. The acquisition was too important to stop. The board wanted growth, the investors wanted certainty, and Richard intended to give them both. The presentation had barely reached the financial projections when the conference room doors opened. James Porter walked in. Richard's expression hardened. "Who authorized this?" James didn't answer. He placed a leather folder on the table. "I believe the board should see these before approving a $620 million acquisition." Several directors exchanged uneasy glances. Richard stood. "This is a private board meeting." "It concerns the company," James replied. "So does this." He opened the folder. The first document was the original 17-year-old partnership agreement. James explained that Thomas's strategic rights had never been fully transferred. A second set of documents showed contractual obligations Whitmore Global Holdings had accepted but later failed to honor. Then came the acquisition records. Certain assets included in the $620 million purchase were connected to rights that remained legally disputed. The room grew increasingly uncomfortable. One director looked at Richard. "Did you know about this?" Richard's jaw tightened. "We were reviewing historical documentation." James placed another page on the table. "This clause remains enforceable." Marcus Hale reached for the document. His eyes moved across the page. Then he looked at Richard. "You knew?" Richard didn't answer immediately. Marcus's expression changed. For years, he had trusted Richard with the company's most sensitive decisions. He had assumed every major risk had been disclosed to him. Now he realized there were parts of the acquisition Richard had deliberately kept outside the discussion. "This changes the deal," Marcus said. "It changes everything," another director replied. Richard looked around the table. The people who had spent years nodding when he spoke were no longer looking at him with certainty. They were looking at the documents, at James, at one another, and finally at Richard. For the first time, the threat wasn't coming from Thomas. It was coming from the truth. Richard slowly sat down. Across the table, Marcus closed the folder. "I think," he said quietly, "we need to know what else you haven't told us." Richard had spent years believing that ownership belonged to whoever had the money to enforce it. That belief was about to collapse. James placed one final document on the boardroom table. "This is the current rights schedule." Richard glanced at it, then stopped. The document identified the controlling strategic rights attached to the target company's most valuable logistics technology. The rights had never been transferred to Whitmore Global Holdings. They belonged to a holding entity controlled by Thomas Carter. Richard looked up sharply. "That's impossible." James shook his head. "It's documented." Marcus took the paper from him and read the ownership structure twice. Then he understood. The technology at the center of the $620 million acquisition could not be fully commercialized without Thomas's cooperation. Richard's acquisition wasn't simply complicated. It was incomplete. Without Thomas, the deal could not close as planned. The room remained silent. Richard finally understood why Thomas had never needed to threaten him. He already possessed the one thing Richard couldn't buy. But there was something Richard understood even less. Thomas could have used those rights to launch an enormous legal claim against Whitmore Global Holdings. He could have exposed the broken promises. He could have challenged the company's historical expansion. He could have demanded financial compensation that would have shaken Richard's empire and damaged his reputation. Instead, Thomas walked into the room carrying a single folder. He looked at Richard. "You have two choices." Richard said nothing. "First, we go to court. Everything becomes public. The agreements, the employee records, the promises you made 17 years ago, and the rights your company continued using after they were supposed to be protected." Richard's face tightened. And the second, Thomas's voice remained calm. "You correct what was done." He explained what that meant. Honor the original agreement. Protect the employees whose contracts had been disregarded. Restructure the acquisition so the disputed rights were properly recognized. And publicly acknowledge the history of the partnership instead of continuing to present everything as Richard's achievement. No revenge. No demand for Richard's company. Just the truth. Richard stared at the man across the table. For 17 years, he had seen Thomas as a quiet man who had walked away because he couldn't compete. Now he understood the reality. Thomas hadn't walked away because he was powerless. He had walked away because he had chosen not to fight. And the one thing Richard had mistaken for weakness had become the most dangerous leverage in his entire empire. For the first time, Richard had no advantage left to hide behind. The acquisition was restructured 3 weeks later. There was no dramatic courtroom battle, no public spectacle, no collapse of Whitmore Global Holdings. Thomas had never wanted any of that. The original agreement was formally recognized. The disputed strategic rights were restored, and the employees affected by the old restructuring were offered new contracts with the protections Thomas had demanded 17 years earlier. For the first time, the truth about the partnership was also acknowledged publicly. Richard Whitmore had not built that expansion alone. The admission cost him pride, perhaps more than money. When he finally stood before Emma, there was no boardroom audience and no carefully prepared statement. Just a father-in-law who had spent years looking down on her. "I was wrong," Richard said. Emma studied him quietly. "You were." He lowered his eyes. "I treated your family as though you had something to prove." Emma's voice remained calm. "We didn't." Richard nodded. She didn't embrace him. She didn't tell him everything was forgiven. But she accepted his apology for what it was, a beginning, not a clean ending. Daniel made his own decision soon afterward. He stepped away from the immediate succession plan at Whitmore Global Holdings. For the first time, he wanted to build his future without simply inheriting his father's. Marcus remained with the company but proposed major governance reforms, including independent oversight of acquisitions and clearer disclosure requirements for the board. Thomas was offered a senior advisory position. He refused. He had no interest in replacing Richard. He didn't want another office, another title, or another empire. He wanted his daughter to know that none of those things had ever been necessary. One evening, Emma visited him at home. They stood beside the old garage. Thomas looked at her and smiled. "You never needed my money," he said. "You only needed me to remember when to use my voice." Emma understood. Her father had spent 17 years choosing silence because he believed silence could protect the life he had built for her. But when that protection was no longer enough, he had spoken, not to prove his worth, not to destroy another man, only to defend the people he loved. Across the city, Richard sat alone in his office, looking at the old photograph from 17 years earlier. For years, he had believed Thomas's silence meant weakness. Now he finally understood. It had never been weakness. It had been restraint. In the months that followed, the Whitmore family changed in ways no business report could measure. Emma stopped looking at the Whitmore mansion as a place where she needed to prove that she belonged. She no longer measured herself against the family's wealth, connections, or expectations. She had learned something far more valuable. Her worth had never depended on whether Richard Whitmore approved of her. It had been there long before she entered his family. Daniel changed too. For years, he had lived beneath his father's shadow, believing that becoming Richard's successor meant becoming the man Richard wanted him to be. But after everything that happened, Daniel finally understood that inheritance was not the same as identity. He could respect his father without becoming his father. He could build something of his own, and Thomas never tried to take Richard's place. He could have returned to the business world. He could have demanded a position, reclaimed influence, or reminded everyone what he had once helped create. He did none of those things. Instead, he went back to the quiet house where Emma had grown up. The old garage remained. So did the steel cabinet. But the secret inside it no longer needed to protect anyone. One evening, Emma stood beside her father as the sun disappeared behind the rooftops. "Do you ever regret walking away?" she asked. Thomas thought about it for a moment. "No." Then he looked at his daughter. "I didn't walk away from my life. I chose it." Emma smiled. Across the city, Richard still had his company, his fortune, and the office overlooking everything he had built. But he had lost something he once believed was more important than all of it, the certainty that power made him superior. Sometimes he still looked at the old photograph from 17 years earlier, and he remembered the man standing beside him. Not a billionaire, not a powerful executive, just Thomas Carter, a quiet man who could have fought long ago but chose patience instead. Richard had spent 17 years mistaking restraint for weakness. That had been his biggest mistake. Because a person's value cannot be measured by the clothes they wear, the house they live in, or the number printed on a bank statement. Money can reveal what someone owns. Power can reveal what someone controls. But character reveals who someone is when they have every reason to use that power and choose carefully not to. And sometimes the person everyone overlooks is the one who understands that better than anyone else.